They said he was a fool. When Jake Morrison signed the divorce papers and walked away from a $10 billion fortune without taking a single cent, the media called him the broke ex-husband. His wife, tech mogul Victoria Sterling, laughed all the way to the IPO, thinking she had buried him. She thought silence meant surrender, but she forgot one thing. Silence isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's the calm before the storm. 12 months later, Jake didn't just return to court. He arrived on the tarmac in a Gulfstream G700, owned by the one man Victoria feared more than market collapse. This is the story of how the man who left with nothing came back to take everything. The air inside the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue carried that recycled chill unique to buildings where money displaced oxygen. From the 92nd floor, Manhattan stretched out like a circuit board, cold and mechanical. Jake Morrison stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, hands in the pockets of jeans that had seen better months. In his right pocket, his fingers traced the edges of a photo. Sarah, age 11, hugging her stuffed bear, grinning with the gap-toothed joy of someone who still believed her father could fix anything. Behind him, ice clinked against crystal. Victoria Sterling Morrison sat on a custom Italian sofa, the kind that cost more than Jake's truck used to be worth before he sold it. She scrolled through her phone with the practiced disinterest of someone checking Asian markets while her marriage dissolved in the same room. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table in a blue folder. Thick, official, final. Her voice came without warmth. "Stop being dramatic, Jake. It's a standard separation agreement. My lawyers at Skadden Arps drafted it. Ironclad, but fair." She still hadn't looked up from the screen. Jake turned from the window. The woman he'd married 8 years ago. The one who'd cried in a Boston coffee shop because her father told her she'd never amount to anything, had been replaced by this. Polished, cold, efficient. Fair? The word came out quieter than he intended. "You're offering me the cabin in Montana and a 3-year stipend. In exchange, I sign an NDA forbidding me from ever mentioning—" His throat tightened. "From mentioning Marcus." Now she looked up. Her eyes, once warm brown, had become boardroom glass. "Marcus is my chief operating officer. He's vital to the company. I won't have your jealousy affecting the IPO. The board is sensitive, Jake. We go public in 3 months. He's your lover, Victoria. Has been for 2 years. Something flickered across her face. For half a second, something human lived there. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of the woman who used to read bedtime stories to Sarah. Then it vanished, replaced by the CEO's mask. He's a partner, something you ceased to be a long time ago. Jake took a slow breath. Sarah had asked him that morning why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. She was 11 years old and didn't understand why the woman who used to braid her hair now refused to see her. He told his daughter that sometimes grown-ups make hard choices. He didn't tell her that her stepmother had called those bedtime stories a waste of billable hours. "Sarah asks about you. She's 11, Victoria. She doesn't understand why the person who used to—" Victoria's voice went ice sharp. "Sarah will be fine. Children adapt quickly. And I was never her mother, Jake. I never wanted to be anyone's mother." The words landed like a slap. Jake stared at the woman on the sofa. "You're right. You never wanted to be a mother. But I thought you wanted to be a wife. At least once upon a time." Victoria stood, setting down her scotch with the precise control of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. She moved to the table where the papers waited. "Listen carefully. You can sign and take the cabin plus the stipend. Or you can fight and watch me bury you in legal fees until you're selling your father's watch to buy groceries for Sarah. I will crush you, Jake. You haven't worked at a real company in 7 years. You think debugging code in our basement makes you employable? The threat hung in the air between them. Victoria picked up the Mont Blanc pen, the one he'd given her on their first anniversary, and held it out, waiting, expecting tears or rage or negotiation. She thrived on conflict, had built her company on the backs of investors she'd charmed, then cornered. Jake crossed the room, took the pen. Victoria's smile started to form, premature and predatory. I don't want the cabin. Her smile froze. The Miami condo, then. Better weather. Good schools for... I don't want the condo. I don't want the stipend. The room went very quiet. Outside, the city hummed its mechanical song. Inside, Victoria's carefully constructed world began to tilt. What are you talking about? Jake flipped to the asset division page, drew a single line through the entire section, initialed it. I want nothing. I'll sign your papers, I'll sign your NDA, but I'm striking the clause regarding spousal support and asset division. I'm leaving with what I brought in. Nothing more, nothing less. Victoria laughed. The sound came harsh and jagged, like breaking glass. You're bluffing. You have no income, Jake, no savings. You think playing martyr will make me chase you? It won't. I'm not playing. He signed his name at the bottom. The ink dried fast. Then he removed his wedding ring, simple tungsten carbide, bought at a pawn shop when they'd had more dreams than dollars, and placed it on top of the blue folder. You can keep the money, Victoria. Every cent, the penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the private jet. You can keep Marcus. He met her eyes and saw something flicker there again. Fear, maybe, or confusion. But you don't get to keep my respect, and you don't get to buy my silence. I'm giving it to you for free, which means you owe me nothing. He walked to the private elevator. Behind him, Victoria's voice cracked for the first time all night. Jake, if you walk out that door with nothing, don't come crawling back when reality hits. I'll destroy you. The elevator doors opened. Jake stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, he saw her standing there holding the scotch glass, looking not like a conqueror, but like someone trying to locate an error in code she didn't write. The descent took 40 seconds. Jake watched the floor numbers drop and thought about Sarah, waiting in the borrowed apartment of a college friend who'd taken pity on them. His daughter deserved better than a father who'd let pride cost her stability, but she also deserved a father who could look her in the eye and explain the difference between what's easy and what's right. The lobby gleamed marble and money. Jake walked out carrying 2 duffel bags containing everything he owned. At the curb, he flagged down a Greyhound bus heading west. The driver looked at him, suit jacket from better days, bags that had seen airports and dreams, and nodded. Jake climbed aboard. He didn't look back at the tower of glass and steel that had once been home. Manhattan disappeared behind him as the bus merged onto I-80, carrying him toward California and an uncertain future where at least his daughter would still have a father who chose honor over wealth. 9 months later, the radiator in the Winnebago hissed like a dying snake. Jake Morrison sat at the fold-down table, staring at his laptop screen while the riverside heat turned the trailer into a mobile oven. Outside, the temperature had hit 110 degrees. Inside wasn't much better. The bank account balance blinked red. $340.18. Sarah sat across from him, math homework spread across the table, chewing her pencil with the concentration of someone trying to solve problems bigger than algebra. She'd grown thinner in 9 months. They both had. The trailer park charged $450 a month for the dirt lot, which meant Jake's overnight shift at the Amazon warehouse, picking orders for $18 an hour, barely covered rent and ramen noodles. "Dad, can I use your laptop for my science project?" Jake looked up from the job rejection email he'd been reading. Number 43. Apple this time. The message carried the same polite brutality as the previous 42. "Thank you for your interest in the senior software engineer position. However, we have decided to pursue other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs." 7 years of employment gap? 7 years labeled homemaker/unpaid labor on a resume that once included MIT and contributions to open source projects that powered half the internet. But HR algorithms didn't care about old GitHub commits. They cared about continuous employment, and Jake's CV had a crater where his career should have been. "The Wi-Fi here is terrible, kiddo. After I get some sleep, I'll take you to the public library. They've got better connection." Sarah bit her lip. The gesture reminded him of her mother, her real mother, who'd left when Sarah was 2 because motherhood didn't fit her Instagram aesthetic. Victoria had stepped into that void with surprising grace, at least for the first few years. She'd taught Sarah to read, to question, to think. Then somewhere between Series B funding and the Forbes profile, Victoria had stopped seeing Sarah as a person and started seeing her as a liability on the balance sheet of ambition. "Kids at school asked why I don't have an iPad like them. I said," Sarah's voice got smaller, "I said you're saving up to buy a better one." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. This was the fear that woke him at 3 a.m. after his warehouse shift, the terror that kept him applying for jobs he'd never get. Not poverty itself, but watching his daughter learn to lie to protect his pride. He'd walked away from $10 billion to preserve his dignity. But what was dignity worth when your child had to invent stories to explain why she couldn't afford what her classmates took for granted? Jake slid out of the booth seat and crouched to eye level with Sarah. Her eyes, his eyes, dark and serious, met his. "Sarah, look at me. I'm sorry. I know this life is hard, but I promise I'm going to make things better." She wrapped her arms around his neck, the hug fierce and desperate. "I don't want you to be sorry. I just want you to stop being sad." Over her shoulder, Jake could see the remains of their dinner, store-brand mac and cheese, the kind that came in boxes of 12 for $10. Outside, someone's radio played corridos through the thin trailer walls. This was what choosing principle over pragmatism looked like. This was the price of walking away clean. Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she spoke, her voice carried a gravity that made her sound far older than 11. "My teacher says the most important people aren't the richest people. So you're the most important person to me, Dad." Jake hugged her again, throat too tight for words. Later, after Sarah fell asleep on the twin bunk that doubled as her bedroom, he opened his laptop at the Riverside Public Library. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Around him, other people without home internet hunched over computers, chasing job applications and disability forms and whatever fragments of the American dream still functioned on public Wi-Fi. Jake typed his name into Google. The results made his stomach turn. TechCrunch, the gold digger husband who fled before Payflow's IPO. Business Insider, sources say Jake Morrison demanded $50 million, vanished with secret gambling debts. Page 6, Victoria Sterling's ex-husband, unemployed, unstable, and entitled. The articles painted a picture of a man who didn't exist. According to Victoria's PR machine, run by Marcus Vance with the efficiency of a military operation, Jake had been controlling, financially abusive, possibly addicted to gambling. The stories claimed he'd embezzled household funds, that he'd abandoned his wife before the IPO to shake her down for more money. that his instability had threatened the company's pre-IPO valuation. All lies. Sophisticated, sourced, credible lies from anonymous insiders and people who'd never met him. Victoria controlled the narrative because Victoria controlled the media contacts. She was the rare female tech CEO, a diversity icon, a woman who'd broken the glass ceiling in Silicon Valley's boys' club. The press loved her, and when the press loves someone, they'll believe anything that person's team feeds them. Jake closed the laptop before he could read more. A mother and daughter sat at the next computer, the girl about Sarah's age, working on what looked like the same science project. They had an iPad. The mother had a wedding ring. They looked tired but intact. The family that hadn't been shattered by ambition and betrayal. His phone buzzed. Email notification. For a second, hope flared. Maybe one of the applications had converted to an interview. He opened it. LinkedIn. Thank you for your interest in the junior software developer position at Junior. He'd co-built the architecture for a platform now valued at $20 billion, and he was getting rejected for junior positions that paid $60,000 a year? The email didn't bother explaining why. It didn't have to. 7-year gap. No references willing to vouch for him because Victoria had poisoned every well in the industry with quiet phone calls and carefully worded warnings. Jake walked back to the trailer park as the sun set over Riverside, painting the California desert in shades of orange and rust. Sarah was already asleep when he climbed into the Winnebago. Her math homework still spread across the table, pencil marks showing the effort she'd put into solving for X, while her father solved for survival. He sat in the dark, listening to her breathe. Maybe Victoria had been right. Maybe walking away had been weakness disguised as principle. Pride was expensive, and his daughter was paying the interest. But then he remembered the look on Victoria's face when he'd signed those papers. For just a second, she'd seemed almost afraid. And Jake realized that everything she'd done since, the smear campaign, the blacklisting, the coordinated destruction of his reputation, hadn't been about protecting the IPO. It had been about making sure he could never come back, about ensuring he stayed buried. That kind of overkill meant something. It meant Victoria was afraid of something. He just didn't know what yet. The storage unit in Riverside smelled like cardboard and regret. Jake had paid $85 a month to keep this 10 by 10 space full of boxes from his marriage, but the last payment had bounced. The facility had sent a final notice: clear it out or they'd auction the contents to cover the debt. Sarah helped him load boxes into a borrowed pickup truck. His college roommate had loaned it for the afternoon, the kind of favor that came with awkward silences about how far Jake had fallen. Most of the boxes contained junk, Christmas decorations Victoria had insisted on buying, books neither of them had read, the accumulated debris of a life that had looked successful from the outside. "Dad, what's this?" Sarah held up a dusty external hard drive, the kind that had been cutting edge in 2016, but now looked like archaeological evidence. Someone had labeled it in faded Sharpie. Payflow Alpha Build, 2016. Do not delete. Jake's heart kicked against his ribs. He'd forgotten about this. 3 years into the marriage, Victoria had gone through a paranoid security phase after a competitor tried to poach her engineers. She'd demanded Jake wipe all company files from personal devices. He'd complied, after creating a backup and hiding it in a box of winter clothes. Insurance, he told himself, just in case. That's an old work thing, sweetheart, from a long time ago. Sarah turned the drive over in her hands. Can we throw it away? We need space in the truck. No. The word came out sharper than intended. No, we keep that one. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, Jake plugged the hard drive into his laptop. The trailer's overhead light flickered as the drive spun up, ancient platters groaning to life. Files appeared on the screen, hundreds of them. Source code, design documents, email chains, technical specifications. The complete architecture of Payflow's transaction processing system, frozen in time from 2016. Jake opened the core algorithm file. Transaction underscore processor underscore v1.0.py. The code scrolled past, familiar as his own handwriting. Then he saw it, embedded in the comments. Hashtag encryption validation loop. Hashtag check for redundancy in key rotation. JM. Hashtag to do. Stress test under high volume conditions. JM. Jake Morrison. His initials, his comments, his architecture. He opened another file. Payment underscore gateway underscore logic.rs. More evidence. / fallback protocol if primary server fails. / Jake. Make sure this handles edge cases in mobile transaction. The memory crashed back with crushing clarity. Late 2016. Victoria's startup was dying. The beta test crashed every time transaction volume spiked above a few hundred users. Investors were threatening to pull their Series A funding. The company had maybe 6 weeks before it ran out of runway. Jake had spent 72 hours straight in the basement, surviving on coffee and the desperate energy of someone trying to save his wife's dream. He'd rebuilt the entire back end from scratch, architected a system that could scale to millions of transactions, implemented encryption protocols that would pass banking security audits. He'd saved the company, saved Victoria's reputation, saved their future. She'd promised to make him co-founder. It never happened. She'd explained that investors didn't respect husbands on the cap table, that it looked like nepotism, that she needed to establish herself as the sole technical vision behind Payflow. Jake had believed her, had accepted the ghost engineer role because he loved her and trusted her and thought partnership meant more than titles. He kept digging through the files, found the patent filing buried in a subfolder. Predictive transaction algorithm with dynamic encryption. Filed October 2016. Inventor Victoria Sterling. Status approved. Jake's name appeared nowhere, not as co-inventor, not as contributor. Nowhere. The screen blurred. Jake realized his hands were shaking. Victoria hadn't just taken his money in the divorce, she'd taken his mind. She'd stolen the work of his hands and brain, patented it under her name, built a $10 billion empire on code he'd written, then convinced him he was worthless. She'd made the world believe he was a parasite, while she sold his genius to Wall Street. The trailer felt too small. Jake stepped outside, needing air. The riverside night was still hot, the kind of desert heat that didn't break even after sunset. Above, stars struggled against the light pollution from Los Angeles 50 miles west. Somewhere in that glow, Victoria sat in her penthouse, preparing for an IPO built on stolen code. And nobody knew. Nobody except Jake, standing in a trailer park with $300 to his name and proof of intellectual property theft that he couldn't afford to prosecute. Sarah appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad? You okay?" Jake turned. His daughter stood there in an oversized t-shirt that served as pajamas, concern etched on her young face. She looked so much like him, the dark eyes, the serious expression, the way she bit her lower lip when worried. She deserved better than this trailer. Better than a father who'd chosen pride over pragmatism. But she also deserved a father who could show her that some things mattered more than money, that integrity wasn't negotiable, that when someone stole from you, you didn't bow your head and accept it. "I'm okay, kiddo. Just thinking." About Mom? She meant Victoria. Sarah still sometimes called her that, even though Victoria had made it crystal clear she wanted no part of stepmother duties. About work stuff, old work. Come on, let's get you back to bed. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and sat down at the laptop again. The patent document glowed on the screen. October 2016. Jake Morrison, erased. Victoria Sterling, inventor and genius. Not for much longer. 3 days later, someone knocked on the trailer door with the kind of authority that made cheap aluminum rattle. Jake had been researching intellectual property lawyers, all of whom wanted $50,000 retainers he'd never have. He'd applied for legal aid and been told his case didn't qualify. Stolen code wasn't a civil rights issue. It was just another contract dispute in a system designed to favor whoever could afford better lawyers. The knock came again, harder. Jake opened the door. Standing in the dust and heat of the Riverside Trailer Park was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a different reality entirely. Late 50s, silver hair cut military short, posture that suggested either special forces or a lifetime of discipline that amounted to the same thing. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Jake's truck had been worth. In one hand, he carried a leather briefcase. Behind him, a black Cadillac Escalade sat idling, air conditioning running, windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets. Jake Morrison? The voice carried flat Midwest vowels and the kind of calm that came from men who'd seen combat and survived. Jake's instincts, honed from years of reading people in code review meetings, said this wasn't a process server. Process servers didn't arrive in $60,000 SUVs. Who's asking? My name is Marcus Thorne. I represent Harrison Cole. The man paused, watching Jake's face for recognition. I believe you met him 10 years ago in Detroit. The name triggered a memory Jake had buried under a decade of other concerns. Detroit, 2014. Jake had been working union electrical at a coal defense industries plant. Good pay, while he figured out his next move after a startup had folded. There'd been an explosion in the main assembly building. Gas leak, someone had said later. Jake had been walking past when he heard the blast, ran toward it instead of away. Because that's what you did when training, and instinct overrode self-preservation. He'd pulled an older man from beneath a collapsed gantry, administered CPR while others ran for help. The man had survived a heart attack. Jake had left before the ambulances arrived, before anyone could take his name or make him fill out incident reports. He'd just done what needed doing, then gotten back to work. I remember the factory fire. Didn't know who I helped. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Approval, maybe. You saved Harrison Cole's life. He's been looking for you for 10 years. His security team finally matched biometric data from backup factory cameras to your DMV records. He wanted to thank you years ago, but when he learned you'd married Victoria Sterling, he assumed you were happy and wealthy. He kept his distance. Then he saw the divorce. Exactly. And the terms of that divorce made him suspicious. Thorne glanced at the trailer, the dusty lot, the evidence of how far Jake had fallen. He had his team investigate Payflow's financials. Not the public filings, the real numbers. Jake's pulse quickened. Why would a defense contractor care about a fintech company's books? Thorne set the briefcase on the trailer's rickety steps and clicked it open, pulled out a single sheet of paper. Because Harrison Cole hates thieves. And Victoria Sterling is a thief. The document was a bank transfer record. Cayman Islands, a shell company called Vance Holdings, LLC. The number at the bottom made Jake's vision tunnel. $300 million. Marcus Vance. Jake breathed. Correct. Your ex-wife's lover and chief operating officer. She's been moving assets offshore to hide them from IPO auditors. And from you. Under New York equitable distribution law, if one party conceals assets during divorce proceedings, the entire settlement can be voided. The concealing party typically forfeits 100% of hidden assets to the spouse. Jake took the paper. The numbers didn't feel real. $300 million in an account named after the man who'd helped destroy his marriage. Victoria hadn't just betrayed him. She'd done it with the kind of calculated precision that spoke to months of planning. This can't be the only reason Cole sent you. He doesn't know me. Why would he spend resources on this? Thorne closed the briefcase. Harrison Cole's younger brother, David, was a software engineer. 20 years ago, a business partner stole David's code, patented it, built a company worth $200 million. David sued but couldn't afford good lawyers. He lost. A year later, he killed himself. The words came flat and hard. Harrison swore that if he ever found another case of IP theft, he'd burn the thief down. Not for money, for David. The trailer door opened. Sarah appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder, ready for school. She stopped when she saw the stranger. Thorne looked at her, then at Jake. Understanding crossed his features. Mr. Cole wants to offer you the services of his legal team. Quinn Emanuel, the best IP litigators in the country. He wants to fly you to Montana to brief you on everything we've uncovered about Victoria's fraud. Jake felt Sarah's hand slip into his. She didn't understand what was happening, but she understood enough to know it mattered. I can't even afford a bus ticket to L.A. Thorne almost smiled. Harrison Cole doesn't expect you to fly commercial. There's a car waiting to take us to Van Nuys Airport. The jet's fueled and ready for Bozeman. He looked at Sarah. There's space for both of you. Mr. Cole has a granddaughter about your age. You'll have your own room at the ranch. Tutors, horses, if you're interested. Sarah's grip on Jake's hand tightened. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much hope and too much fear. This could be a trap. It could be another rich person's game. Or it could be the chance Jake had been praying for without admitting he still believed in prayer. He thought about Victoria in her penthouse, about Marcus Vance counting offshore millions, about the code Jake had written that was about to make them both billionaires. He thought about Sarah lying to her classmates about iPads, about his daughter watching him break a little more each day. Give us 10 minutes to pack. The Gulfstream G700 sat on the tarmac at Van Nuys like a silver promise. Jake had seen private jets before, back when he traveled with Victoria to investor meetings. But this was different. The Cole Defense Industries logo gleamed on the tail. Everything about it spoke of serious money spent seriously, not the flashy wealth of tech founders, but the quiet power of someone who'd built an empire on government contracts and American manufacturing. Sarah's eyes went wide as they climbed the stairs. The interior smelled of leather and coffee. No cramped seats. Instead, a living area with cream-colored divans, a conference table, monitors showing flight paths and stock tickers. A flight attendant in a crisp Navy uniform waited at the top of the stairs. Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee, juice for the young lady? Sarah looked at Jake for permission. He nodded. Orange juice would be great. They settled into seats that felt like clouds with structural support. Sarah pressed her face to the window as the jet began to taxi. Jake watched his daughter's wonder and felt something crack open in his chest. This was what childhood should look like. Possibility and excitement, not shame and scarcity. Thorne sat across from them as the jet accelerated down the runway. The push of thrust pressed them back into leather. Then they were airborne, California falling away beneath them, the sprawl of Los Angeles giving way to desert, then mountains, then the long, empty spaces of the American West. Once they reached altitude, Thorne unbuckled and moved to the conference table, gestured for Jake to join him. Sarah stayed at the window, orange juice in hand, watching clouds. "You're wondering why Thorne said. Why Harrison Cole would spend this kind of money on a man he met once for 20 minutes a decade ago." The thought crossed my mind. Rich men don't do favors. They make investments. You're right to be suspicious. Thorne pulled 3 photographs from a folder. This is an investment, but not in money. Harrison Cole has enough money to buy half of Montana. This is an investment in justice. The first photo showed Victoria and Marcus at some gala, his arm around her waist. She wore a diamond necklace Jake recognized, the one she told him was too expensive for their anniversary, the one she'd apparently bought for herself. The second photo was a patent filing document. October 2016. Victoria Sterling listed as sole inventor. The third was a close-up of code appendix, zoomed in on a comment line. / check flow for redundancy. JM. That's your work, Jake. Not just contribution, authorship. You didn't help her company. You are the company. She stole your intellectual property, patented it, and built an empire selling your mind to Wall Street. Jake stared at his own initials preserved in a document Victoria had filed with the patent office. Evidence. Proof. The thing he'd thought he could never afford to gather. Thorne wasn't finished. He pulled out another document, this one dense with technical jargon. There's more. Last year, Victoria tried to update your algorithm to handle cryptocurrency transactions. She hired offshore contractors in India and Ukraine because she couldn't afford Silicon Valley rates and didn't want anyone who might question the code's origins. But she didn't understand the foundational architecture you built. The contractors introduced a catastrophic flaw. Jake leaned forward, his engineer brain snapped to attention. What kind of flaw? A dormant bug in the encryption key rotation. If transaction volume exceeds a certain threshold, which it will when the stock opens on IPO day, the system destabilizes. It won't just crash, it will expose user financial data, bank accounts, social security numbers, transaction histories. Millions of users. The biggest data breach in fintech history. The implications cascaded through Jake's mind like falling dominoes. He could see exactly what had happened. His original architecture had safeguards built in. Volume throttles, progressive failure modes, encryption key backups. But someone who didn't understand why those safeguards existed might see them as inefficient, might strip them out to improve performance metrics without realizing they were removing the system's immune system. She doesn't know, Jake said. Not a question. She surrounded herself with yes men. Marcus Vance knows nothing about code. The offshore contractors got paid to implement features, not audit security. No one dares tell Victoria Sterling that her castle is built on sand. The jet hummed through thin air at 40,000 feet. Below, the Rockies scraped at the sky, peaks still white with snow even in late spring. Sarah had fallen asleep in her seat, head tilted against the window, exhausted by hope. Thorne laid out the final piece. Harrison Cole has a proposition. We don't sue Victoria for the money. Not initially. Jake frowned. I don't understand. If we sue now, she settles, writes you a check for 50, maybe 100 million, just to make you disappear before the IPO. She fixes the bug quietly. The IPO proceeds. She becomes a billionaire. She wins. Thorne's eyes were cold and clear. Is that what you want? A check? Jake thought about the trailer park, about Sarah's gap-toothed lie to her classmates, about media articles calling him a gold digger, while Victoria sold his genius to the world. About the bedtime stories Victoria used to read and the woman she'd become. No, I want her to admit it. I want everyone to know she didn't build it. I want her reputation. Good. Then we don't attack her wallet. We attack the IPO. Thorne opened a thick binder. In 3 months, Payflow goes public on the New York Stock Exchange. Projected valuation, $20 billion. Victoria stands to make $8 billion personally, but the company's entire value is based on your algorithm, the one she patented, the one that's currently broken. The plan crystallized as Thorne explained it. Let the IPO proceed. Let Victoria walk on stage at the New York Stock Exchange. Let her ring the opening bell. And at the exact moment trading begins, file an emergency injunction claiming stolen intellectual property and critical security flaws. Attach proof of the bug. Prove that Jake Morrison is the only person who knows how to fix it. The stock will tank, Jake said slowly. The IPO will collapse. She loses everything. Not just money, trust, reputation, credibility. The SEC will investigate. Investors will sue for fraud. She'll be radioactive in every boardroom in America. Outside the window, Montana appeared on the horizon, vast and empty and beautiful in a way that made California's sprawl seem small. The jet began its descent toward Bozeman. Sarah woke up, rubbing her eyes. Are we there? Almost, kiddo. She looked out at the mountains, the endless sky, the kind of landscape that existed in movies and dreams. Dad, is this real? Jake didn't know if she meant the jet or the mountains or the possibility that their lives might change. He took her hand. Yeah, sweetheart. This is real. The Cadillac Escalade that met them at Bozeman Airport smelled like new leather and Montana spring. They drove through landscape that looked like God had decided to show off. Rolling grassland backed by mountains that still held snow on their peaks. Fence lines that ran to horizons. Cattle that grazed under skies so big they made you remember how small people were. Sarah pressed her face to the window. It's like a Western movie. The ranch appeared after 20 minutes of dirt road. A gate made of welded steel and timber, the Coal Defense Industries logo burned into wood. Beyond it, 5,000 acres of private land. The main house rose from the landscape like it had grown there. Massive logs and native stone. Architecture that spoke to the American West without kitsch or pretension. This wasn't the rich man's vanity project. This was a fortress built by someone who understood that real power didn't announce itself. Marcus Thorne led them through a hallway lined with history. Photographs of Harrison Cole in Navy SEAL dress whites. Harrison shaking hands with 3 different presidents. Harrison at ribbon cuttings for factories in Michigan and Ohio, surrounded by workers in hard hats. A Medal of Honor in a glass case, the citation readable. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The library smelled like wood smoke and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out at the Bridger Mountains. A fire burned in a hearth big enough to stand in, and in a wheelchair by that fire, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the spring warmth, sat Harrison Cole. He was smaller than Jake remembered from Detroit. The heart attack and decade had taken their toll, but his eyes, steel gray and sharp, missed nothing. The electrician with the steady hands. The voice came rough but clear, pure Midwest American, the kind of accent that disappeared from television but still lived in places where people worked with their hands. You look tired, son. Life's been rough on you. Sarah hid behind Jake's leg. Harrison's gaze shifted to her. And this is your daughter. Pretty girl. Got your eyes. Smart eyes. He tapped the wheelchair's armrest. Don't be scared, sweetheart. I look mean, but I'm harmless. You like horses? Sarah nodded, shy. This ranch has 40 of them. My ranch manager, Buck, will teach you to ride. But first, I need to talk to your daddy alone. A woman appeared, ranch manager's wife, Thorne explained, and led Sarah away toward the kitchen and promises of fresh cookies. Jake watched his daughter go, then turned back to Harrison Cole. Sit. Jake sat in a leather chair that had probably cost more than a month's rent on the trailer. The fire crackled. Outside, Montana spread vast and indifferent to human concerns. Thorne showed you the patent? Yes, sir. And the Cayman accounts? Yes, sir. Harrison leaned forward. The firelight made his face look carved from old wood. Victoria Sterling is a fool. A dangerous fool. I've seen her type my whole life. In the military, in business. People who think that because they have money or rank, they have power. They forget that money's just ammunition. Intelligence is the weapon. He paused. You know what decides who you shoot at? No, sir. Honor. Honor is what decides. And you, Jake Morrison, you've got all three. Money you can get. Intelligence you have. But honor. Harrison gestured at the Medal of Honor on the wall. That can't be bought or faked. You walked away from $10 billion because it was the right thing to do. That's rare as hell. Jake felt something tighten his chest, loosen. She stole my work, sir. Built her empire on code I wrote. I know she did. And I know why it matters to you. Harrison's voice went quieter. My brother David was a software engineer. Smart kid. Brilliant, really. 20 years ago, a business partner stole his code, patented it under his own name, built a company worth $200 million. David sued, couldn't afford good lawyers, lost. Year later, he ate his gun in a motel room in Tulsa. The words hung heavy. Jake understood now. This wasn't charity. This was revenge served cold across 2 decades. I swore on David's grave that if I ever found another case of IP theft, I'd burn the thief to the ground. Not for money, for him. Harrison's eyes locked on Jake's. Victoria Sterling stole from you. She made the world think you're worthless while she sold your genius to Wall Street. That ends. You understand me, son? That ends. Yes, sir. Good. Now listen. We've got 3 months before that IPO. Thorne's going to coordinate with Quinn Emanuel, best IP lawyers in the country. They'll be here tomorrow. You're going to spend the next 10 days learning how to testify, how to present your case, how to handle hostile cross-examination. We're going to rebuild you from the ground up. And then we're going to fly back to New York and destroy her empire on live television. Jake thought about Sarah lying to her classmates, about Victoria's smirk when she'd offered him the cabin and stipend, about 9 months of rejection and humiliation. What do I need to do? Harrison smiled for the first time. It was not a kind smile. You need to remember every line of code you wrote, every conversation you had, every promise she made and broke. You need to become the architect again, Jake. Not the broken ex-husband. The architect who built a $10 billion company and is coming to collect what's his. Outside, Sarah's laughter carried through the open window. She was already making friends with the ranch manager's granddaughter, already forgetting the trailer park. Jake heard that sound, pure and unguarded, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't doing this for money. He wasn't even doing it entirely for justice. He was doing it so that someday, when Sarah was older, he could look her in the eye and tell her the truth. That when someone steals from you, you don't bow your head. You fight. And sometimes, if you're lucky and stubborn and backed by a billionaire with his own demons, you win. I'm ready, Jake said. Harrison Cole nodded. Good, because come October, we're going to war. The library at Cole Ranch became a war room by morning. When Jake woke in a guest bedroom bigger than the entire Winnebago, sunlight already slanted through windows that framed the Bridger Mountains like a photograph of everything he'd lost. His daughter slept in the adjacent room, the door between them open because Sarah still had nightmares about the night Victoria's security had escorted them from the penthouse while photographers documented their humiliation. Marcus Thorne appeared at 7 with coffee and a manila folder thick enough to stop bullets. Legal team arrives at 9. Natasha Reyes from Quinn Emanuel flew in from Los Angeles last night. 2 forensic accountants from Chicago land in 20 minutes. Technical experts from Silicon Valley at noon. He set the folder on the dresser. This is everything we have on Victoria's financials. You should read it before Natasha starts asking questions. She doesn't believe in gentle interrogation. Jake opened the folder. Bank statements showing money flowing through shell corporations in patterns designed to confuse auditors. Email chains between Marcus Vance and offshore attorneys discussing asset protection strategies. Corporate filings that listed Victoria as sole inventor on patents covering technology Jake could prove he'd architected. Each page built a case that should have been ironclad, but Jake had watched enough corporate litigation to know that should and would lived in different universes. Sarah found him an hour later, still reading. She'd already been to the stable, already made friends with Emily Cole, Harrison's 12-year-old granddaughter who'd lost her father to an IED in Kandahar, and understood what it meant when families shattered. The girls were planning to ride horses after lunch, if Jake said it was okay. And could they please, Dad? Because Emily's pony was named Buttercup, and Sarah had never ridden a real horse before. Jake looked at his daughter's face, lit up in ways he hadn't seen since before the divorce, and realized Harrison Cole had bought something more valuable than legal expertise. He'd bought Sarah a childhood where she didn't have to lie about iPads or pretend their poverty was temporary. For that alone, Jake would have walked through fire. Of course you can ride. Just listen to the trainer and wear a helmet. She hugged him and ran off, already calling for Emily. The sound of her laughter echoed down the hallway like a promise that better days might actually exist. Natasha Reyes arrived in a helicopter that landed on the ranch's private pad with the aggressive efficiency of someone who measured time in billable hours. She was younger than Jake expected, mid-40s, with close-cropped black hair and eyes that dissected people like code awaiting debug. She wore a suit that managed to look both expensive and practical, and when she shook Jake's hand, her grip carried the pressure of someone who'd spent decades proving she belonged in rooms that didn't want her. The library had been transformed overnight. The conference table that yesterday held Harrison's military memorabilia now supported 3 laptops, 2 printers, and enough legal documents to reconstruct the entire history of Payflow from incorporation to impending IPO. Whiteboards lined one wall, already covered in timelines and financial flowcharts. This was litigation as military operation, and Jake was the mission objective. Natasha sat across from him, didn't smile, didn't waste time on pleasantries. Why did you sign the divorce papers? Jake opened his mouth to answer. She cut him off. Don't tell me you wanted to leave. That makes you look weak. Don't tell me you are tired of fighting. That makes you look defeated. Don't tell me you thought it was the right thing to do. That makes you look naive. She leaned forward. Victoria's lawyers will paint you as a bitter ex-husband who made a bad deal and now wants a payout because your bank account's empty. They'll say you're having seller's remorse. Why did you sign? The question hit like a fist. Jake had spent 9 months asking himself the same thing, usually at 3 in the morning when insomnia and shame kept him company. He'd rehearsed answers that sounded noble or principled or dignified. They all rang hollow now. Because I didn't know she'd stolen my life's work. Because I trusted her when she said the company was hers. I signed under duress caused by fraudulent concealment of intellectual property. Natasha's expression didn't change. Prove it. I have the backup drive with, objection, you're pleading, you're asking permission to be angry. She stood up, paced to the window, turned back. You're the architect, Jake. Stop talking like you're renting space in your own story. The critique stung because it was accurate. Jake had spent 9 months accepting the narrative Victoria's PR team had written. Unemployed, unstable, entitled. He'd internalized the lie so deeply that even now, with proof of theft in a manila folder, part of him still believed he'd somehow earned this. For 3 days, they dismantled him. Natasha asked questions designed to expose every weakness in his testimony. Why hadn't he kept better records? Why had he agreed to work without formal compensation? Why had he believed Victoria's promises about co-founder status? Each question peeled back another layer of self-deception until Jake stood naked before the truth. He'd been complicit in his own erasure because he'd loved someone who'd seen that love as exploitable weakness. On the 4th day, they started rebuilding. Technical experts walked Jake through the codebase he'd written, forcing him to articulate not just what he'd built, but why. The architecture wasn't just elegant, it was necessary. Every design decision addressed specific scaling challenges that Victoria's offshore contractors had misunderstood. The bug they'd introduced wasn't just dangerous, it was evidence of fundamental ignorance about how the system worked. Jake found himself inhabiting the code again. Payflow wasn't Victoria's machine, it was his mind translated into logic gates and encryption protocols. Seeing how she'd corrupted it with incompetent updates felt like watching someone deface a cathedral because they didn't understand load-bearing walls. Show us the flaw, Natasha demanded. Jake pulled up the current Payflow source code on one of the laptops. Someone on Victoria's team, probably Marcus Vance's nephew, who'd been hired straight out of a coding boot camp and given a senior title because nepotism, had made catastrophic changes. Here, line 847. They removed the volume throttle I built into the encryption key rotation. His finger traced the screen. Without it, when transaction volume spikes above 10,000 simultaneous requests, which will happen the instant trading opens on IPO day, the system tries to regenerate encryption keys faster than it can validate them. It creates a cascade failure. The firewall drops. User data gets exposed. One of the technical experts, a woman named Chen, who'd done security audits for the Department of Defense, leaned in. Can it be fixed? 4 hours if you know what you're doing. 4 months if you don't. Victoria doesn't even know the bug exists. Natasha smiled for the first time since arriving. It was not a warm smile. That's the nuclear option. We prove the code is stolen and dangerous. We prove you're the only one who can fix it. The SEC halts trading. Victoria's empire collapses on live television. Jake thought about Sarah, currently learning to canter on a pony named Buttercup, while Emily Cole shouted encouragement. His daughter deserved more than revenge, but she also deserved a father who fought back when wronged, who showed her that integrity wasn't just about walking away from fights. Sometimes it meant bringing a fight to someone who'd assumed you'd never stand up. Let's do it. The training intensified. They ran mock depositions where Natasha played Victoria's attorney with such vicious accuracy that Jake sometimes forgot they were on the same side. She attacked his credentials, his employment gap, his motives. She suggested he'd stolen the backup drive from Victoria's servers, She implied the code comments with his initials could have been added retroactively. She made him so angry that twice he stood up and walked out, which was exactly the point. "You think Victoria's lawyers will be nicer?" Natasha's voice followed him into the hallway during one of these exits. "They'll eviscerate you if you let emotion override evidence. Get back in here." By the end of the first week, Jake had memorized not just the code, but the timeline. October 2016. Payflow beta test failing. Investors threatening to pull funding. Jake spending 72 hours rebuilding the back end while Victoria handled investor relations. The patent filing 3 weeks later with her name as sole inventor. The pivot from near bankruptcy to Series B funding in under 6 months. Every milestone built on architecture Jake could prove he'd created. Sarah appeared in the library one afternoon while Jake reviewed depositions. She'd grown browner from Montana sun, stronger from riding horses and hiking trails with Emily. The two girls had become inseparable, teaching each other things. Sarah explaining coding concepts while Emily demonstrated how to read weather patterns in clouds. "Dad, Emily says her grandpa wants you to have dinner with him tonight. Just you two." Jake looked up from the legal briefs. "Did he say why?" Sarah shrugged. "Grown-up stuff, probably. Can I stay over in Emily's room? We're making a website about horses." The request was so normal, so beautifully mundanely normal, that Jake almost couldn't process it. This was what 11-year-olds should do. Sleepovers and websites and friendships uncomplicated by poverty or shame. "Sure, kiddo. Just brush your teeth and don't stay up too late." Harrison Cole sat in the same chair by the library fireplace. Though autumn had arrived in Montana, and the fire now fought against genuine cold rather than the memory of winter. He'd aged visibly, even in the week Jake had been at the ranch. The heart condition was winning its long war against stubbornness and will. "Sit down, son. Pour yourself a bourbon if you want. I'm not supposed to drink anymore, so I do it vicariously through guests." Jake sat, didn't pour the bourbon. Harrison watched him with those steel-gray eyes that had seen men die and empires built and probably didn't miss much. "Natasha says you're ready. Says you can handle hostile cross-examination, stay calm under pressure, articulate technical concepts for a jury that doesn't understand binary code. That true?" "I think so, sir." "Don't think. No. Because once we file that injunction, there's no backing out. Victoria will come at you with everything she has left. The media will dig into your past. They'll find every mistake, every failure, every moment of weakness. You need to be sure, Jake, not for me. For that girl upstairs making websites with my granddaughter." The firelight painted Harrison's face in shadows and age. Jake understood what wasn't being said. This fight would cost Harrison resources and reputation. If they lost, if Victoria's lawyers proved Jake had fabricated evidence or stolen the backup drive or acted out of spite rather than legitimate grievance, the blowback would damage Cole Defense Industries. Government contracts depended on reputation. Harrison was betting his legacy on Jake's honesty. "I'm sure. She stole my work, patented it, built an empire on my mind, then destroyed my reputation when I walked away. That ends now." Harrison nodded slowly. "Your daughter asked me today if rich people are always mean. Emily apparently told her about some kids at her old school who made fun of her after her daddy died because she cried at lunch." He paused. "I told her that money doesn't make people mean. It just makes it easier for mean people to hide what they are. And sometimes it takes away the consequences that keep mean people in check." The old man shifted in his wheelchair, pulling the blanket tighter. Victoria Sterling started out scared. Her daddy told her she wasn't smart enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't enough, period. So she built armor out of ambition and ruthlessness. But somewhere along the way, the armor became the person. She forgot that the best things in life, loyalty, honor, love, can't be bought or patented or taken to market. Jake thought about the Victoria he'd married in that Boston coffee shop, the woman who'd cried on their wedding day because her father refused to attend, the stepmother who'd read Dr. Seuss to Sarah with funny voices and genuine affection. That woman had existed once. Maybe she still existed somewhere beneath the CEO's armor, but it didn't matter. The woman who'd stolen his code and destroyed his reputation wasn't someone he could reach with appeals to past affection. She made her choices, sir. Now she gets to live with the consequences. Good. Harrison rang a small bell on the side table. Marcus Thorne appeared from wherever he waited when not needed. Show him the transformation timeline. Tomorrow, we start Phase 2. Phase 2 meant visual reconstruction. Harrison believed in semiotics, the language symbols sent before words could complicate messages. Jake couldn't walk into a New York courtroom wearing the clothes of defeat. Victoria would appear in Armani, polished and powerful, backed by lawyers in suits that cost more than cars. Jake needed to project something different. Not wealth trying to match wealth. Authority that came from competence rather than capital. The Taylors arrived from New York the next morning. Not a single vendor, but a team. Specialists in American menswear from Tom Ford's Atelier and Brooks Brothers' Bespoke division. They didn't bring casual options. They brought structure and power dressed as simplicity. Jake stood in what had been a guest bedroom and was now a temporary fitting room, being measured and pinned while 3 people discussed fabric weights and shoulder construction like military strategists planning an invasion. Charcoal gray wool from mills in Massachusetts, white cotton from looms that had supplied dress shirts to presidents, black leather shoes from a maker in Maine who'd been crafting Oxfords since before Jake was born. When they finished, Jake barely recognized his reflection. The suit fit like it had been grown rather than made. American cut, with broad shoulders and clean lines that suggested competence without ostentation. No tie, open collar. The message wasn't wealth, it was confidence that didn't need decoration. Sarah saw him and stopped dead in the hallway. "Dad, you look like a superhero." Jake knelt down to her level, careful not to wrinkle the suit. "I'm not a superhero, sweetheart. Just a dad who's fighting for what's right." She hugged him hard enough to crush the careful tailoring. "That's what makes you a superhero." Emily appeared behind her, grinning. "My grandpa says you're going to make the bad people pay. Is the bad people your ex-wife?" Jake glanced at Thorne, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Emily, that's not... It's okay." Jake stood up, smoothed the suit. "Yeah, kiddo. The bad person is my ex-wife. She took something that wasn't hers. We're going to get it back." Emily nodded with the certainty of a child who'd learned young that the world broke people, and sometimes those people had to break back. "Good. Grandpa says thieves are worse than cowards because cowards only hurt themselves." The girls ran off, already planning their next adventure. Thorne watched them go. Harrison doesn't sugarcoat reality for Emily. Her father died because someone in the supply chain stole funds meant for armor plating and bought himself a beach house in Miami instead. She understands that theft kills. Jake thought about that, about a bureaucrat's greed translating to shrapnel through a Humvee, about Emily growing up without a father because someone decided money mattered more than lives. The stakes here were different, but the principle was the same. Victoria had stolen something that wasn't hers, and the theft had consequences that rippled outward to touch people who'd never met her. 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, Victoria Sterling sat alone in the penthouse that no longer felt like home. Marcus Vance was in Chicago, meeting with institutional investors who wanted assurances about Payflow's security infrastructure before committing to the IPO. The apartment echoed with expensive emptiness. She'd had the interior designer remove anything that suggested Jake had ever lived here. His books, his coffee mugs, the framed photo of Sarah's first day of kindergarten. The space looked like a magazine spread now, perfect and soulless. Victoria opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she kept locked even from cleaning staff. Inside was a single photograph, bent at the corners from being held too many times. Boston, 2015. A coffee shop near MIT. Victoria, fresh out of Wharton with an MBA and crushing debt, and a father who'd told her she'd never make it because women didn't understand technology. Jake, across the table, laptop open, explaining some algorithm he was building just for the joy of creation. She remembered that afternoon with painful clarity. Jake had listened to her pitch for a thin-tech startup with the kind of attention that made her feel seen rather than evaluated. Then he'd sketched architecture on a napkin, showing her how to solve scaling problems she hadn't even identified yet. They'd talked for 4 hours. By the end, they had a plan. She'd handle investors and business development. He'd build the technology. Partners. That partnership had become romance. Romance had become marriage. For the first few years, it worked. Victoria raised funding while Jake architected miracles in their basement. They were a team. Then her father called after the Series A closed. "You letting your husband build the company? What happens when he leaves and takes the only brain in the relationship with him?" The words had burrowed deep. Victoria started asking herself what would happen if Jake left, if investors realized she didn't understand the technology that powered her own company, if her father was right about her fundamental inadequacy. So she'd taken precautions, filed the patent under her name alone, told Jake it was for tax purposes, for investor optics, for a dozen reasons that sounded plausible when wrapped in financial jargon. He'd believed her because he loved her, and she'd let him believe because she needed to prove her father wrong more than she needed to deserve Jake's trust. The affair with Marcus had started as strategic networking. He was connected, experienced, knew how to navigate the politics of going public, but somewhere in those late-night strategy sessions, Victoria had found someone who wanted her for her power, rather than despite it. Marcus didn't care that she couldn't code. He cared that she could command a room, close a deal, project the kind of confidence that made investors write checks. Jake had cared that she was human. Marcus cared that she was useful. And when Victoria's father died of a heart attack 2 years ago, the last thing he'd said to her in the hospital was that she still hadn't proven she was capable of running a company without a man's help. She'd kicked Jake out 3 months later. Now, sitting in a penthouse that felt like a mausoleum, Victoria looked at the photograph and wondered what it cost to be right. Her father was dead. Jake was gone. Marcus stayed for the money and would leave when a better offer appeared. The IPO would make her rich beyond measure, but she'd be rich and alone in ways that had nothing to do with marital status. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, texting from Chicago. "Investors are solid. IPO on track. You should be celebrating." Victoria put the photograph back in the drawer, locked it, poured herself 3 fingers of scotch, and stood by the window looking out at Manhattan. Somewhere down there, 8 million people were living lives that didn't require them to choose between love and validation. She'd chosen. Made her choice clear when she signed the patent, when she started the affair, when she'd looked Jake in the eye and offered him crumbs from the table he'd built. No taking it back now. The IPO was in 8 weeks. After that, she'd have enough money to prove her father wrong forever. That would have to be enough. Back in Montana, Marcus Thorne handed Jake a single sheet of paper. They stood in the library where so much of the preparation had happened, but now the whiteboards were clean and the laptops packed. Tomorrow they'd fly back to New York. Tonight was the final briefing. This is the kill switch. Technical analysis of the security flaw. Once this gets entered into the public record, the New York Stock Exchange will halt trading on Payflow immediately. The moment you file it, Victoria's empire ends. No going back. Jake took the paper. The analysis was brutal and precise. Chen's work, vetted by 3 independent security experts who'd all reached the same conclusion. The bug wasn't just dangerous, it was catastrophic. And fixing it required understanding architecture that only one person could explain. She'll hate me for the rest of her life. Thorne's expression didn't change. She already destroyed you, made you invisible. This just makes you visible again. And her nightmare is that the world will finally see you. Jake folded the paper into his jacket pocket. The new jacket, perfectly tailored, built for a man about to walk into a war. Sarah appeared in the doorway, backpack on, ready for the flight back east. She'd cried saying goodbye to Emily, promised to video chat every day, made plans for summers in Montana that assumed a future where Jake could afford plane tickets and hotel rooms and all the infrastructure of normalcy. Dad, I don't want to leave. Can we stay? Jake knelt down, took her hands. We can't stay, sweetheart. But this isn't goodbye to Montana. It's goodbye for now. You promise we'll come back? He thought about the injunction waiting to be filed, about Victoria's lawyers and the media storm and all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. But he also thought about the code he'd written, the evidence he'd gathered, the truth that would out regardless of how many PR firms tried to bury it. I promise. After we finish what we started, we'll come back. Sarah hugged him. Over her shoulder, Jake saw Harrison Cole being wheeled into the library by a nurse. The old man looked diminished by illness and age, but his eyes were as sharp as the day they'd met. Take care of my grandson, Jake. That girl's got the Cole stubbornness and her daddy's honor. Don't let the world beat it out of her. Jake stood, still holding Sarah's hand. I won't, sir. And thank you. For everything. Harrison waved the gratitude away. Thank me by winning. Go to New York. File that injunction. Show them what happens when they steal from someone with nothing left to lose. The Gulf Stream climbed out of Bozeman into darkness. Below, the lights of Montana spread thin across vast emptiness. Sarah fell asleep within an hour, head against Jake's shoulder, exhausted by the adrenaline of the last 10 days. She'd learned to ride horses and build websites and believed that people could be kind without expecting payment. Thorne sat across the cabin, reading documents in the soft glow of overhead lights. Outside, America passed beneath them. Mountains giving way to plains, plains to the Great Lakes, lakes to the eastern seaboard where density replaced space and opportunity came measured in what you could take rather than what you could build. Jake pulled out his iPad, opened Victoria's Instagram. Her latest post showed her at the New York Stock Exchange, red power dress and confident smile, standing before the building where Payflow would go public in 6 weeks. The caption read, "Tomorrow we make history. Hashtag Payflow, hashtag Women in Tech, hashtag Self-Made." The comments flooded in, praise and inspiration, and women thanking her for breaking barriers. Self-made, the lie everyone believed because Victoria had destroyed the evidence of collaboration so thoroughly that even people who should have known better accepted the narrative. Jake closed the app. The lie would live another 6 weeks. Then it would die on live television. And Victoria would learn what every builder eventually understood. Foundations matter, and buildings constructed on stolen ground don't survive earthquakes. They landed at Teterboro in the dead hours before dawn. The New York metro area spread below them like a circuit board, orange sodium lights marking streets that never slept. This was Victoria's city, her territory, the place where she'd built her reputation and connections, and the kind of power that came from being featured in the right magazines and invited to the right galas. But it was also the city where Jake had learned to code in college, where he'd built his first startup in a Brooklyn loft before it failed and taught him that failure was just data. New York didn't belong to Victoria. It belonged to whoever could survive its indifference to sentiment. 2 black SUVs waited on the tarmac. Thorne had arranged accommodations at a boutique hotel in Tribeca. Nothing flashy, but clean and secure, and close to the Southern District Courthouse, where the injunction would be filed. Sarah stirred as they descended the stairs, blinking at city lights that turned the sky orange. "We're here? We're here, kiddo. Are we going to win, Dad?" Jake looked at his daughter, 11 years old and already learning that the world required fighting for what was right. He could have lied, offered her the comfortable fiction that good always triumphed over evil. But Sarah deserved truth. "I don't know, but we're going to fight. And sometimes fighting is enough." She took his hand as they walked to the waiting cars. Behind them, the Gulf Stream sat on the tarmac like a promise that retreat was still possible. Ahead, Manhattan rose in glass and steel, and all the machinery of American capitalism that rewarded winners and forgot losers with equal efficiency. The hotel room overlooked the Hudson. Sarah fell asleep within minutes, exhausted by travel and time zones. Jake stood at the window watching boats move upriver against the current, thinking about code and patents and the moment 6 weeks from now when he'd walk up courthouse steps and file papers that would detonate Victoria's empire. His phone buzzed. Text from Thorne. "Team meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., Quinn Emanuel offices. Natasha wants to run final prep before we file. Get some sleep." Jake set the phone down, looked at Sarah sleeping in the adjacent bed, one arm around the stuffed bear she'd had since birth. She'd already lost one mother to selfishness. Victoria had been the second chance, the stepmother who'd read stories and taught her to think critically and shown her that women could build empires. Then Victoria had chosen the empire over the child. If Jake failed, if Victoria's lawyers proved he'd fabricated evidence or acted out of spite rather than legitimate grievance, Sarah would learn that fighting for what's right sometimes ended in defeat. But if he succeeded, she'd learn something more valuable: that competence outlasted credentials, that work mattered more than titles, that the person who built something always understood it better than the person who claimed credit. Tomorrow the preparation would end. The real war would begin. And somewhere in a penthouse 92 floors above the city, Victoria Sterling was sleeping soundly, confident that the man she'd dismissed as obsolete would never have the resources or courage to challenge her. She was wrong, and in 6 weeks, the entire world would watch her learn exactly how wrong. Jake closed the curtains, lay down on the hotel bed, closed his eyes and saw code scrolling past like poetry. Lines he'd written in a basement while Victoria charmed investors upstairs, architecture that had saved a dying startup and launched a billion-dollar empire. His mind, his work, his creation. Tomorrow, he'd start taking it back. The morning of the IPO arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made New York look like the city people moved here hoping to find. Victoria Sterling woke at 5 in the penthouse that had never stopped feeling empty, despite the furniture designer's assurances that minimalism projected power. She'd barely slept. Adrenaline and ambition made poor bedfellows, but her reflection showed none of the exhaustion. The stylist had arrived at 4:30 to ensure perfection. Hair pulled back in a severe bun that framed her face like a helmet, Makeup applied with surgical precision. The red Armani dress hung on the closet door, aggressive as a declaration of war. Marcus Vance appeared from the guest bedroom where he'd been sleeping since the Chicago trip. Their relationship had calcified into something transactional. He provided operational expertise and social legitimacy. She provided proximity to wealth that would make them both billionaires by noon. Romance had died somewhere between Series C and the Forbes cover, replaced by the kind of partnership that thrived on mutual advantage rather than affection. You ready for this? His voice carried none of the warmth that it held when they'd first started the affair, just assessment, calculation. Victoria stepped into the dress, let him zip it. I've been ready for 10 years. The limousine crawled through morning traffic toward Lower Manhattan. Victoria checked her phone compulsively. Stock futures, news alerts, social media reactions to last night's media blitz. Everything pointed to triumph. Analysts predicted the stock would open at 45 and hit 80 by lunch. Payflow's user base had grown 30% in the last quarter. Revenue projections exceeded even the most optimistic models. The technology worked flawlessly, processing millions of transactions daily without a single security breach. She'd built this, taken a failing startup and transformed it into a fintech juggernaut. Her father had been wrong about her capabilities, wrong about women in tech, wrong about everything. Today she'd prove it to a corpse and a world that had spent a decade doubting. The New York Stock Exchange loomed ahead, neoclassical columns bathed in morning light. Photographers lined the street, cameras already flashing. Victoria stepped from the limousine into a wall of attention. This was the validation she'd craved since business school. The world watching, documenting, acknowledging her as someone who mattered. Inside the VIP balcony overlooking the trading floor, champagne waited in ice buckets. Board members and early investors clustered in expensive suits, projecting confidence that masked the terror endemic to every IPO. Fortunes would be made or lost based on numbers that flickered across screens, and everyone pretended the randomness was somehow controlled. Victoria stood at the railing, looking down at traders gathering below. The opening price was set at $45 per share, $20 billion valuation. She'd own 40% of that after dilution, $8 billion. More money than her father had made in his entire career at the hedge fund, where he'd spent decades proving he was smart enough to manage other people's wealth. Marcus appeared beside her, champagne already in hand. You look like $8 billion. She corrected him automatically. I look like someone who earned $8 billion. He smiled without warmth. Of course. Self-made, right? The edge in his voice registered somewhere beneath Victoria's focus. They'd discuss it later. Or not. After today, she'd have enough money to replace anyone who became inconvenient, Marcus included. At 9:20, 5 minutes before opening bell, someone from the exchange staff approached with a clipboard. Standard final checks. Everything was ready. The gavel waited on the podium. Confetti cannons were loaded. Cameras positioned to capture the moment Victoria Sterling rang in the future. She checked her phone one last time. No messages from Jake. No drunk texts or desperate pleas for reconciliation. Just silence, which was exactly what she'd paid lawyers and PR firms to ensure. He was buried in California somewhere, working warehouse night shifts, unable to afford the bus fare to cause problems. Perfect. At 9:25, Victoria took her position at the podium. The traders below looked up expectantly. Cameras focused. This was the moment every entrepreneur dreamed about. Validation rendered in market capitalization and media attention. Across town, the Gulfstream touched down at Teterboro with the kind of precision that came from pilots who'd flown combat missions before retiring to corporate aviation. Jake Morrison had spent the flight silent, conserving energy for what came next. Sarah sat beside him, trying to look brave, despite the nervousness that made her chew her thumbnail down to nothing. Marcus Thorne checked his watch. 35 minutes to courthouse. Traffic's heavy on the FDR. We need to move. 2 black SUVs waited on the tarmac, engines running. Jake had dressed in the Montana tailor's work, charcoal suit that fit like it understood his body better than he did. White shirt with no tie, because confidence didn't need decoration. He looked nothing like the man who'd signed divorce papers 12 months ago. That Jake had been defeated, diminished, accepting of his own obsolescence. This Jake was an architect, coming to reclaim stolen blueprints. Sarah hugged him before climbing into the second SUV with Thorne's security team. "Dad, I'm scared." Jake knelt to her level. "Me too, sweetheart. But being scared doesn't mean we don't do what's right." "What if we lose?" The question deserved honesty. "Then we lose. But at least we'll lose fighting, not hiding." She kissed his cheek and climbed into the SUV. Jake watched her go, then slid into the lead vehicle. The driver, former Secret Service Thorne had mentioned, activated a siren that wasn't strictly legal, but was effective at parting traffic. They tore out of Teterboro toward Manhattan, covering ground at speeds that would have resulted in arrest for anyone without Harrison Cole's connections greasing the machinery. Jake opened his iPad, pulled up CNBC's live stream. There was Victoria at the New York Stock Exchange, red dress blazing, holding the gavel like a scepter. The ticker at the bottom read, Payflow IPO, Tech's biggest day. She looked triumphant, certain, a woman who'd never considered the possibility that the past might reach forward and drag her down. The SUV screamed down the FDR, weaving through traffic that grudgingly made space. Thorne sat beside Jake, briefcase containing the injunction and supporting evidence. 50 pages of documentation proving intellectual property theft, fraudulent patent filing, concealment of assets, and a security flaw that put millions of users at risk. Enough to halt the IPO and destroy everything Victoria had built on stolen foundation. 9:28, Thorne noted. 2 minutes to opening bell. We'll make it. The Southern District Courthouse rose ahead, granite and authority, and the kind of institutional weight that made lies collapse under scrutiny. Jake could see photographers already gathered on the steps. Harrison Cole's PR team had tipped them off that something significant was happening, though not what. They expected maybe a corporate rival filing suit, or perhaps a regulator raising last-minute concerns. They weren't expecting the ghost of Victoria's past. The SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. Jake stepped out into a wall of flashbulbs. The photographers had been lounging, casual, but the sight of him emerging from an expensive vehicle in a suit that screamed competence rather than desperation made them scramble. Cameras swung toward him. Someone shouted a question Jake couldn't parse through the noise. He walked toward the courthouse steps with Thorne flanking him. Each footfall felt like moving through water, time dilating, sound muffling, the whole world narrowing to this moment where he either reclaimed his life or confirmed every awful thing Victoria's PR machine had claimed about him. A reporter from Bloomberg thrust a microphone toward his face. "Mr. Morrison, are you here to stop the IPO?" Jake stopped, turned to face the cameras directly. Every lens focused on him, thousands of viewers watching through screens in offices and homes across the country. Somewhere, Victoria was preparing to ring the opening bell, confident that the man she'd dismissed as obsolete would never find the resources or courage to challenge her empire. The words came clear and cold. "My name is Jake Morrison. I'm not here to stop the IPO. I'm here to report a crime." The courthouse steps suddenly went silent. Even the traffic noise from Pearl Street seemed to fade. Jake turned and walked through the revolving doors into the marble lobby where American justice theoretically waited for everyone, even those who couldn't afford it, until a billionaire with his own demons decided to sponsor vengeance. At 9:30 exactly, Victoria brought the gavel down. The sound echoed across the trading floor like a gunshot. The opening bell rang, not the gentle chime people expected, but a full brass clanging that vibrated in the chest. Confetti exploded from cannons mounted in the balcony, raining down in Payflow's corporate colors. The room erupted in cheers. On the massive display screen, the ticker symbol appeared. PYFL. Opening price, $48. Already $3 above expectations. 52! Someone shouted from the floor. 55! 60! The numbers climbed with the kind of momentum that made fortunes in minutes. Victoria grabbed a champagne flute, raised it toward Marcus. To us. To the Empire. They drank. The champagne tasted like vindication and futures rendered in market capitalization. This was the moment every entrepreneur chased, the transformation from struggling to successful, from doubted to undeniable. Her father was dead, but if ghosts existed, his was watching her prove him wrong with every tick upward on the stock price. Then the massive screen went dark, just for a second. When it flickered back to life, the feed had changed, no longer showing the trading floor. Instead, CNBC's breaking news banner slashed across in urgent red. The anchor's face appeared, pale and shocked. We're interrupting coverage of the Payflow IPO with breaking news from the Southern District of New York. A massive emergency injunction has just been filed against Victoria Sterling and Payflow Holdings. Victoria's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattered on the polished floor. Around her, the celebration died, like someone had cut power to life support. The camera cut to courthouse steps. There stood Jake Morrison, not the broken ex-husband from tabloid photographs, but someone completely transformed. Charcoal suit, white shirt, standing beside a woman Victoria recognized from legal conferences. Natasha Reyes. Quinn Emanuel. The kind of attorney who didn't take cases she couldn't win. The anchor continued. The plaintiff, Jake Morrison, former husband of Ms. Sterling, alleges that Payflow's core source code was stolen from him. The filing includes technical analysis claiming the software contains a catastrophic security flaw that puts all user data at risk. The presiding judge has granted an immediate temporary restraining order pending SEC review. On the trading floor below, the celebration transformed into chaos. Traders who'd been cheering moments ago now scrambled toward terminals, trying to execute sells before the bottom dropped out. A floor official's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. Trading halted! Code red! Trading halted on PYFL, pending regulatory review. The numbers on the display screen froze. $62 per share. The graph that had been shooting upward like a rocket went flatline. Dead. Victoria stared at the screen, at Jake's face, calm and implacable, looking directly into the camera with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just cold certainty that he was right and she was finished. It's a lie. Her voice came out hoarse, barely audible, then louder. It's a lie. He's crazy. He's broke. Marcus pulled away from her, already checking his phone, his face drained of color. Victoria, the news, it's everywhere. #1 trending. They're posting the patent documents, code comparisons, your name. Victoria fumbled for her phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Twitter had exploded. #PayflowFraud dominated trending topics. LinkedIn filled with posts from former colleagues expressing shock. The Wall Street Journal had already published a breaking news alert questioning the validity of her technical credentials. Someone grabbed her arm. She spun, expecting Marcus, instead found two men in dark suits that marked them as federal rather than corporate. Behind them, more suits. SEC regulators with briefcases and the kind of expressions that meant someone's empire was about to undergo invasive examination. Miss Sterling, I'm Agent Morrison with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need you to come with us for questioning regarding allegations of securities fraud and intellectual property theft. The room tilted. Victoria grabbed the railing to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. She'd paid lawyers hundreds of thousands to ensure every filing was clean, every patent legitimate, every disclosure accurate. Jake had signed the divorce papers. He'd accepted nothing. He'd walked away. But he hadn't stayed away. And the realization crashed through Victoria's certainty like a wrecking ball through glass. Jake had never been defeated. He'd been planning. The elevator behind the podium opened. More FBI agents. More SEC regulators. A woman Victoria recognized from the Attorney General's office. This wasn't standard IPO jitters. This was a coordinated federal response to documented fraud. Marcus Vance had backed away toward the far exit, already distancing himself from the blast radius. When Victoria called his name, he didn't turn around, just kept walking, leaving her to face the consequences alone. The confetti still drifted down from the cannons, falling like snow, like ash, like the remains of everything Victoria had built on stolen ground. 3 weeks later, the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue felt like a museum of a life that had ended but hadn't figured out how to die. Movers in blue coveralls systematically packed Victoria's possessions into boxes labeled for storage or disposal. The Damien Hirst painting came down from the living room wall, leaving a pale rectangle on plaster that had never seen direct sun. Crystal vases got wrapped in bubble wrap, designer furniture tagged for auction. Victoria sat on the Italian sofa that had cost $40,000 and would sell for maybe $10,000 at Christie's liquidation sale. She hadn't showered in 2 days, hadn't changed clothes. The red Armani dress from IPO day hung in the closet like a monument to hubris. The SEC had frozen her assets pending investigation. The Payflow board had voted unanimously to remove her as CEO, installing an interim replacement who'd immediately begun cooperating with federal investigators. Class action lawsuits from investors who'd lost money on the halted IPO piled up like cordwood, and the media that had loved her 6 months ago now competed to write the most scathing takedown of the woman who'd built an empire on stolen code. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Victoria didn't look up. Probably another mover asking about furniture she no longer cared about. But the footsteps stopped. Then Marcus Vance's voice, tight with anger. The cards are declined. All of them. Black card, platinum, even the joint account we set up. Victoria finally looked at him. He stood in the doorway, trailing Louis Vuitton luggage, wearing sunglasses indoors like he could hide from association with her failure. It's a temporary freeze. The lawyers are filing motions on Monday to release operating funds. There is no we, Victoria. The words came harsh, final. You told me you wrote the code, told me he was nobody. Now I'm being subpoenaed as a material witness. My face is on CNBC as a potential accomplice to securities fraud. I can't get a reservation at Le Bernardin. Do you understand what that means in this city? He signaled to the movers to take his bags. Victoria stood, voice cracking. Marcus, please. We're partners. You said I was a partner in a billion-dollar company, not a partner in a federal indictment. You're radioactive. Everyone you've touched is radioactive. I'm done. He walked into the elevator without looking back. The doors closed on his indifference. Victoria stood alone in the echoing space, surrounded by the dismantled evidence of success that had never been hers. The view from 92 floors showed Manhattan spreading in every direction, millions of lives being lived by people who'd never heard of Payflow or Victoria Sterling or the cautionary tale she'd become. Her phone buzzed. Text from her attorney. Settlement conference scheduled. Thursday, 2 p.m. Quinn Emanuel offices. Come prepared to negotiate. Victoria knew what that meant. Jake wasn't interested in quiet resolution. He was going to make her sign away everything, publicly admit to fraud, and accept whatever humiliating terms his lawyers demanded. The alternative was federal prison and complete financial ruin. Some choice. The Quinn Emanuel conference room occupied the 45th floor of a midtown tower, all glass and steel, and the kind of expensive minimalism that communicated seriousness. Victoria arrived with her court-appointed attorney. The expensive lawyers had quit when her assets froze and retainers bounced. The public defender was competent but overworked, juggling 50 cases simultaneously, and this wasn't his expertise. They sat on one side of a polished table that reflected the gray October sky outside. On the other side, Natasha Reyes, Marcus Thorne, and 2 junior associates whose only job was taking notes that would become public record. At the head of the table sat Jake Morrison. He wore a navy suit, crisp white shirt, the kind of professional presentation that spoke to competence rather than wealth. Victoria barely recognized him. The man she'd dismissed as obsolete had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd been running companies while she played at it. Worse, he looked calm, not angry, not triumphant, just resolved in a way that made her realize he'd already won and was simply here to formalize the terms. Natasha Reyes opened a folder, all business. Let's be direct. The SEC is willing to offer leniency on criminal fraud charges if Ms. Sterling admits that intellectual property rights to Payflow's core technology belong to Mr. Morrison, and that she knowingly filed fraudulent patent applications. Victoria's attorney cleared his throat. If my client admits that, she loses all equity in the company, all IP rights, everything. Thorne's voice came flat and hard. She's already lost the company. Payflow's board terminated her. The only question is whether she spends the next decade in federal prison or rebuilding her life somewhere else. Victoria stared at the table, unable to meet Jake's eyes. This was worse than losing money or status. This was having to admit on public record that everything she'd built was stolen, that her father had been right about her inadequacy, that she'd never been good enough. Then Jake spoke for the first time. His voice wasn't loud, but it commanded the room with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was worth. I'm taking control of Payflow. The investors have agreed to restructure under new leadership, Architect Systems. I'll fix the security flaw, rebuild the codebase properly, save the valuation, and protect users. He leaned forward, and Victoria finally forced herself to look at him. His eyes held no hatred, just the kind of cold assessment you'd give a problem that needed solving. I don't want to destroy you, Victoria. Destruction takes energy, better spent building. Here's what I'm offering. He tapped the document in front of him. You transfer all IP rights to me. You admit publicly to the fraud, which clears the company's name and allows the restructured IPO to proceed. In exchange, I drop the civil suit for concealed assets. I won't push for criminal prosecution. Victoria's attorney started to object. Jake held up a hand. And because I believe in fairness, even when it hasn't been extended to me, his mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, I'll grant you a monthly stipend for 3 years, and you can have the cabin in Montana. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. The cabin in Montana, the 3-year stipend, the exact offer she'd made Jake 12 months ago when she'd assumed he'd never have the resources to fight back. He was mirroring her own cruelty with surgical precision, reflecting it back so she could see exactly what she'd been. "You can't be serious." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Jake picked up a pen. "I'm completely serious. It's a fair offer. You can fight this, drag it through courts for years while I bury you in legal fees until you're selling jewelry to make rent. Or you can sign, take the cabin, disappear quietly, keep whatever dignity you have left." The words were hers, verbatim, the speech she'd delivered while he stood in her penthouse, broken and desperate. Now he sat across from her in a borrowed conference room, holding all the power she'd spent a decade accumulating, and offered her the same humiliating scraps she'd once thought generous. Victoria looked at her attorney. He gave a tiny nod. Sign or face federal prosecution. Those were the options. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen. The settlement agreement blurred through tears she refused to shed in front of Jake. She signed her name, Victoria Sterling, not the hyphenated Morrison she'd adopted for the marriage, and pushed the papers across the table. Natasha Reyes collected them immediately, as if afraid Victoria might change her mind before ink dried. "It's done." Victoria stood on legs that barely supported her weight. She looked at Jake one last time, searching for some recognition of their shared history. The coffee shop in Boston, the basement where he'd coded miracles while she charmed investors, the bedtime stories he'd watched her read to Sarah with genuine affection before ambition consumed everything. But Jake's expression held no nostalgia, no anger, just the calm certainty of someone who'd taken back what was his and could now move forward. She wanted to say something, apologize, threaten, beg, explain that her father had broken something in her that made love feel like weakness and power feel like survival. But the words wouldn't come. She'd made her choices, stolen his work, destroyed his reputation, assumed he'd never rise from the ashes she'd created. She'd been wrong. And now, the entire world knew it. Victoria walked out of the conference room, down the hallway lined with portraits of Quinn Emanuel's successful cases, and into an elevator that descended toward a future where she'd be remembered not as a self-made tech mogul, but as a cautionary tale about what happened when you built on stolen foundations. Jake remained in the conference room after Victoria left. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Below, the city moved in its perpetual rhythm. Yellow cabs fighting traffic, pedestrians hustling between buildings, the machinery of American capitalism grinding forward without pause for individual tragedy. Marcus Thorne joined him at the window. "Harrison sends his regards, says he knew you had it in you." Jake thought about the old man back in Montana, illness winning its slow war against stubbornness. Harrison Cole had given Jake more than legal representation. He'd given him back the belief that competence mattered, that skill outlasted credentials, that the person who built something always understood it better than the person who stole credit. "How's Sarah?" Thorne asked. "At the hotel with the security team, probably video chatting with Emily about horses." Jake smiled. "She asked if we could go back to Montana for Christmas. I told her yes." "You can afford more than that now. The restructured IPO will make you wealthy." "Not Victoria-level wealthy, but comfortable enough." Jake nodded. The investors had been surprisingly eager to work with him once they understood he was the actual architect behind Payflow's technology. The restructured company, Architect Systems, would go public in 6 months, and Jake's equity stake would be substantial. Not the $8 billion Victoria had been chasing, but enough to give Sarah a childhood where she never had to lie about iPads. Mr. Morrison? One of the junior associates appeared in the doorway. There are media requests for interviews. Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, Bloomberg, CNBC. They all want statements about the settlement. Jake shook his head. No interviews. Issue a brief statement. Mr. Morrison is pleased to resolve this matter and looks forward to focusing on Architect Systems' upcoming IPO. The associate nodded and left. Thorne raised an eyebrow. You're not going to take a victory lap? Explain what she did? Everyone knows what she did. The patent filings are public record. The code comparisons speak for themselves. Jake turned from the window. I'm not interested in grinding her into dust. I just wanted what was mine. They walked toward the elevator together. The building's lobby bustled with attorneys and clients engaged in the endless combat of commercial litigation. Jake had once thought he'd never see the inside of a place like this. Too expensive, too intimidating, too far removed from warehouse night shifts and trailer parks. But Harrison Cole's generosity had opened doors Jake didn't know existed, and walking through them had reminded him that intelligence and competence were currency that bought entry to any room, provided you found the right sponsor. The SUV waited at the curb. Sarah sat in the back seat, video call in progress with Emily Cole. When Jake climbed in, she ended the call and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much uncertainty. Is it over? It's over, sweetheart. Did we win? Jake considered the question. He'd reclaimed his intellectual property, destroyed Victoria's empire, secured financial stability for his daughter. But he'd also learned that revenge, however justified, left a metallic taste. Victoria would spend years rebuilding from the ashes of her humiliation. Marcus Vance had already landed at a competitor, rats and sinking ships. And somewhere in Montana, Harrison Cole was dying slowly, his revenge for a brother's suicide incomplete because David was still dead, and justice couldn't resurrect the past. We got what we came for, Jake finally answered. That's close enough to winning. The driver pulled into traffic. Sarah leaned against her father, exhausted by the emotional toll of the last 3 weeks. Outside, Manhattan scrolled past, the city that had witnessed Jake's defeat and Victoria's triumph, and now their reversal. Buildings that would stand long after everyone involved in this drama had turned to dust and corporate history. Jake's phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. This is Natasha. Excellent work today. If you need representation for the Architect Systems IPO, Quinn Emanuel would be honored. Also, your daughter is lucky to have you. Not many fathers would fight this hard. He saved the number and pocketed the phone. The hotel loomed ahead, boutique and expensive, but no longer impossibly out of reach. Tomorrow, he'd start the real work of rebuilding Payflow's codebase, fixing the security flaws Victoria's incompetent contractors had introduced, preparing for an IPO that would happen on his terms rather than stolen credentials. But tonight, he'd order room service with Sarah, let her pick whatever movie she wanted, and sleep without the weight of injustice pressing on his chest. The SUV pulled up to the hotel entrance. Jake helped Sarah out, tipped the driver, and walked through doors held open by uniformed doormen who'd learned to recognize the newly wealthy by their uncomfortable relationship with service. The lobby gleamed marble and understated luxury. Sarah tugged his sleeve. Dad, can we walk instead of taking the elevator? It's only 5 floors. Jake looked at his daughter, 11 years old, and already understanding that the journey mattered as much as the destination. They took the stairs, climbing slowly, Sarah chattering about her video call with Emily and plans for summer in Montana and a coding project she wanted to build. By the time they reached the 5th floor, Jake felt lighter than he had in 12 months. Not because of victory, because his daughter was happy, safe, planning a future that didn't involve shame or scarcity or watching her father break under the weight of injustice. They ordered pizza, not gourmet hotel room service, but actual delivery pizza with too much cheese and not enough vegetables. Watched a Pixar movie Sarah had seen 6 times. Fell asleep before the credits rolled, Sarah curled against him like when she was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. Jake woke around midnight, carefully extracted himself without disturbing Sarah, stood at the window looking down at the Hudson River, black and unknowable, flowing toward the Atlantic and eventually the world beyond New York's gravitational pull. His phone sat on the nightstand. He could call Harrison, thank him properly for the resources and faith and willingness to weaponize grief in service of someone else's justice. He could call the reporters back, tell his side of the story, ensure that history recorded Victoria's theft accurately. He could post on social media, reclaim the narrative that had been stolen along with the code. But what was the point? The people who mattered knew the truth. The rest would believe whatever fit their existing narratives about tech billionaires and gender politics and the complicated machinery of innovation. Jake had his work back. His daughter had her childhood back. That was victory enough. Tomorrow, he'd start rebuilding. Not just code, but a life where Sarah could grow up watching her father do work he loved, where competence was rewarded rather than stolen, where honor wasn't a luxury reserved for people who could afford principles. The city lights painted the river in streaks of orange and white. Somewhere out there, Victoria Sterling was packing belongings for a cabin in Montana, preparing for exile in the same landscape where Jake had learned to fight back. The symmetry was almost poetic. Jake pulled the curtains closed, climbed back into bed beside his sleeping daughter, closed his eyes and saw code scrolling past. Not the corrupted version Victoria's contractors had mangled, but the original architecture he'd built in a Boston basement before ambition and betrayal had complicated everything. Tomorrow he'd start writing it again. Better this time. Stronger. With security protocols that couldn't be stripped out by offshore contractors who didn't understand why safeguards existed. Code that would carry his initials in every comment, his logic in every function, his mind rendered in syntax so clear that no one could ever again claim they'd built what he'd architected. But tonight he slept, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who'd fought for what was right and survived to build again. Morning arrived with October sunlight streaming through hotel windows that framed Manhattan as a promise rather than a threat. Sarah woke before Jake, already dressed, backpack loaded with the iPad Jake had finally been able to afford.
Dad, Mr. Thorne texted. He wants to know if we want to fly back to Montana for a few days before you start work on Architect Systems.
Jake sat up, rubbed sleep from eyes that for the first time in a year didn't feel heavy with defeat. What do you think?
Sarah grinned. Emily says the aspen are turning gold. We could go riding in the mountains.
Then let's go. They packed quickly. They'd learned to travel light during the months in Riverside. The hotel checkout took minutes. Outside, Marcus Thorne waited beside an SUV that would take them to Teterboro. Montanavin? Thorne asked as Jake loaded bags. Montana. A week, maybe 2. Then back here to start building. Jake looked at the city one last time. But we'll come back on our terms. Not running, not hiding, building. The SUV merged into traffic heading toward New Jersey. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching the city scroll past. Somewhere in those buildings, Victoria Sterling was learning that money couldn't buy back reputation once you'd spent it on lies. Somewhere, Marcus Vance was discovering that loyalty purchased with proximity to power lasted exactly as long as the power did. But Jake wasn't thinking about them anymore. He was thinking about Montana Aspen and his daughter's laughter and code he'd write that would carry his name forward into a future where competence mattered more than credentials, where the person who built something
always understood it better than the person who claimed credit. The Gulf Stream waited at Teterboro, engines already running. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah turned to him with a seriousness that made her seem far older than 11.
Dad, are you happy now? Jake thought about the question. Happiness felt too simple for the complicated mix of relief and grief and satisfaction that came from reclaiming what had been stolen while watching someone he'd once loved destroy themselves with their own choices. I'm at peace, sweetheart. That's better than happy. That lasts longer. They settled into the cabin. The jet taxied toward takeoff. Below, New York receded, the city of second acts and reinvention and the kind of brutal meritocracy that forgave nothing but respected competence. Jake had come here broken and left rebuilt. Not because of money, though that helped. Not because of revenge, though that satisfied. But because he'd finally understood something Harrison Cole had known all along. Honor was what decided who you fought and why. And the person who built on stolen ground always lost eventually, even if it took a decade. The jet lifted into October sky, headed west toward mountains and family and the future Jake would build one line of code at a time. His mind, his work, his creation. Finally, his again.